Hey, this is Matt Ellis from A Hope for Home, and we are about to discuss metal.
This is the Discuss Metal podcast with Matthew Ellis of A Hope for Home. Hosted by Dan Terry, presented by discussmetal.com.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Discuss Metal podcast. It is my pleasure this evening to be speaking with Matt Ellis of A Hope for Home. How you doing tonight, man?
Hey, great. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. So A Hope for Home is a band that I had no business listening to when I started listening to, because like I'm supposed to be this metal guy, right? Like thrash metal, death metal, you know, all the stuff that happened to the 2000s with the singing and the screaming and the breakdowns, like that's all stuff that I'm not supposed to like, right? But you know, I got your CD, The Everlasting Man, and it was honestly probably one of the most honest sounding records in that genre. You know what I mean? Like I was like, because it was really the lyrics that caught me off guard more than anything else, because like most of these bands are writing about their girlfriends, or right, you know, unless you're As Cities Burn, you know, but like so it was definitely something that I really caught on to, and just like really felt like the lyrics were a cut above what you're hearing from that scene. And then, you know, as history goes on, which we're going to get into all of that tonight.
I love it.
So well, I guess just starting off bare bones, and I know you answered some of this in another podcast, so you know, you guys can definitely go listen to his interview with the Black Sheep podcast as well. Those guys are awesome. I love what they're doing. And so I'll just start off simple. Where'd you grow up?
Yeah, I pretty much grew up just in a suburb of Portland, Oregon. You know, technically born in Montana, but this is like at the 0.25 years age. So really Portland, I would say, Portland suburb. And sort of you know, grew up. I technically sort of Vancouver, Washington. Technically the city I was in is Camas, Washington. But it was kind of just what I feel like, and I don't have a super great grasp of what a lot of other people in similar zones are, where I feel like a lot of this kind of music are people who grew up in sort of suburbs of, you know, some major city area, you know. And so what I would just kind of say is like Portland suburbs, I guess.
There you go.
Is sort of just the zone where it kind of all started.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm same. I mean, I tell everybody I'm in St. Louis. I'm actually like south of St. Louis, like, you know, but
gotcha.
You know, you identify with whatever the biggest major city is. So
right, exactly.
So what got you into music, or I guess to keep it on brand, heavier music? So
you know, I have a lot of friends sort of in the similar age range or similar sort of like genres, in which, you know, the story I always hear by friends is like, oh, you know, and this is like, I'm born in 1987, and sort of, at least the best that I can speak of is people in my sort of vague age zone, right? And it's always like people in my age area. It's like, oh, I had an older brother that like had a DC Talk tape, or I had an older brother that had like a Metallica tape, or something like this, right? And like they're the ones that really introduced me to sort of this scene and da. But I was an only child, which sort of made it very weird. And I was an only child, and sort of I grew up in a my mom was very kind of hyper. He kind of wanted to police kind of what I listened to and what I watched. You know, PG-13 was a cutoff, which maybe we'll get into this later. But like, of course, this is the irony that I'm now getting a PhD in film studies, and she's like, "What are you doing?" But you know, it was a very kind of like, I need to very much police your media intake. And my reading of it was, and I don't know if this is exactly right, because you can't quite, you know, rip yourself out of it, is it's like the amount of you need to be very careful about what you're watching. Is I kind of have this gut feeling of like, okay, well, in that case, I'm going to find all of the extracurricular stuff I can sort of find, right? And I'm going to do whatever I can do. But it was very much sort of me on my own. I didn't have an older sibling who was like, you got to check out this like cool late 90s band. You got to check out this like sweet early 90s band or something like that. So I feel like it was a very kind of just kind of dicking around on the internet and like finding bands. And, there's one way in which I could trace the genealogy of how I discovered this. And because I did it on my own, it would be very embarrassing, right? It'd be like something like I went from Creed to early Underoath or something kind of embarrassing like that, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, it's like I didn't have someone in my life who sort of was like, no, you need to listen to this cool record. It was like I was just sort of finding stuff on my own and feeling it out. And I guess that's sort of just kind of what it was, I guess the way into really heavy music, it was really two things, and maybe heavy wasn't the right adjective. There may be two albums I would immediately do, and as I said, there's the sort of like crass, corny pop stuff, but the two sort of main albums I would say really opened my eyes are MXPX's live album from, I think, 1998. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's called like Live at the Show or something like that.
Live at the Rock Show or something like that.
Live at the Rock Show, yeah. And like that's the song, and they had Chick Magnet on the record, and that was it was a live record, and I remember just being like, oh my god, like this is like not just music, but like a band playing in a room and there are people responding to it, and it was the coolest thing I had ever heard. And then the other record is that I was in band like instrumental high school junior high band at the time, right? And actually that's what I did after I graduated high school is I went to go get a music degree, and then I dropped out, and again we can talk about that later. But I very kind of had this feeling of like I somewhat trained is too strong of a word, but I sort of had my feet in sort of classical music, and I was very interested in classical music, and I was also interested in sort of heavy music as well, right? And right at the time that Metallica's S&M album came out, my family's from Montana, and I was visiting my family, and my older cousin Jason had to get his car fixed. And we went just outside Great Falls, Montana, and we got to wait for like 3 hours while I get my brakes fixed on my car, go sit in the waiting room. And in the waiting room of this car dealership in Great Falls, Montana, they had the DVD of Metallica's S&M playing. And it had just come out. And I remember I'm like 12 years old or 13 or, whatever it is at the time. And I walked in and I was like, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen. And it was like, so I would say if there's like some open door, something that sort of like kicked it all off, it was, that MXPX record I think was great, but it was really watching Metallica play with the orchestra, which at the time it was like, I was in the sort of classical music world or whatever. I was like, this is what I want to do, man. Like you can be heavy and you can be pissed off, but like also really interesting, orchestral arrangements and whatever. So, and it's just kind of been that ever since.
That's cool. That's really cool. That's unique too in that, and I think that you can only arrive at a conclusion like that if you're doing your own independent research, as it were, because I think what a lot of the guys that I talk to, and even even myself included, I feel like we all kind of just jumped into like a specific scene and stuck with that. Like we found a record label and stuck with that, or do we, found this or that. And I think largely, I think largely that's why a lot of music in a particular scene ends up just sounding so samey. What is it they say? Like 2% of bands in a specific genre are innovative, and the other 98% are just trying to sound like the 2%.
Right.
So, that's really cool. Yeah, that S&M DVD is hilarious. Actually, it's a funny story. I was when that DVD came out, I was dating a girl who, like, we'd only been on like one or two dates, and we were like, I don't know, like 15. So we were dating, right? And so I remember telling all my friends, yeah, we're going to go over to my house and watch S&M later. And everybody's like, what?
Wait a minute.
Yeah. Well, you have to understand, like, I was so like Christian at that time that like, it didn't even like occur to me what I was even saying. And I even told one of my teachers that, like, oh yeah, me and this, because first of all, I was just super stoked that a girl was coming over to my house. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like, oh my God. And so I'm like, yeah, check out. Yeah. We're going to go over to my house. We're going to eat some dinner. Then we're going to watch some S&M. It's going to be a great night. And everybody's like,
totally unaware of what the thing is. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
What do you mean? It's a concert DVD. Come on.
Yeah, I was like, it's Metallica, duh. Like I was like, they were the ones that weren't getting it. But yeah, that DVD is incredible. I actually just saw I saw S&M 2 in the actually in the theater.
I did the same.
Yeah, last year. That was a ton of fun. But so that mixture of classical music and heavier music, with a little bit of MXPX. So how do we go from that to screaming and breakdowns?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is just kind of the mid 2000s, right? And it's sort of just what the scene was at that moment, which is really interesting to me now thinking about it, right? And thinking back on this moment and sort of what bands have lasted, not just what bands have lasted, but what bands have become kind of the like current the sparks for what would become the emo revival or X revival or whatever, like in the early 2010s or whatever. It's really interesting. I think it's, and this is a thing that I'm not sure, I'm feeling very old now, but like younger kids, like Zoomers kind of in this moment quite understand is how much, like, despite the fact that a lot of this scene and this genre really blossomed to kind of like in the market in the way in which it exploded in the early 2000s, it was still so much of a like, you have to explore to find bands that sound like that sound you want to find, right?
Yeah.
And there's like major label bands that like kind of do it, but they were lame because they didn't do it good enough. And then there were, like up and coming Tooth and Nail bands or Drive-Thru Records bands that like did it, but were like not heavy enough or this kind of thing. And so there's very much this weird, like this kind of negotiating moment. And I guess I would just say it was a matter of being lame and trying to negotiate that until I got old enough to figure out, I think, what I liked. Right.
Sure.
If that makes sense. I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, it does. It does because it's just looking at the difference between the first two records versus the second two. You can tell that there was a moment where I'm into something that kind of everyone's doing. I don't mean that as a slam. It's just I'm going purely cosmetic, as far as the sound, and then you kind of get into Realis and in abstraction, and then it starts being like, okay, so this is what these guys are really into.
No, I'm really great. I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's exactly right, and that's exactly how I would tell the story of sort of the band and what we did. Is what you just said. That's exactly it, right? Is that like we were sort of, in the water, we're treading water, and we're sort of like, we're going to try this for a minute, we're going to try that for a minute, sort of on these first two records. And yeah, I would say it's really Realis where we kind of became I would say we are. It's difficult to say now because we've had 10 years off or whatever, but
right.
What we became was definitely that. But yeah, no, those early records were, I think, and I don't know if this is right, and this would be maybe a conversation for a whole other podcast, but those late 2000s, those mid to late 2000s years, I think were really a fascinating time to be a like heavy-ish band like that, where it was just like there was no kind of hegemony. I mean, there was a hegemony, and it was a certain kind of Victory Records breakdowny kind of like band thing, but it was also like the immediate post Thrice Thursday thing, which we felt more like we always related more to the kind of like post-hardcore Thrice Thursday moment. And then because of the way that the scene worked, we like got lumped in with metalcore stuff, and like we never quite liked the metalcore thing, but like, I mean, I'm probably the one guy in the band that likes metal more than everyone else, but like I didn't want to do like metalcore. I was like, I'm listening, like I like really like interesting metal stuff. But this whole moment never had a really clean cut, clear kind of here's your identity of if you're going to be a heavy band in 2006 to 2009, unless you're doing this very specific Rise Records kind of like breakdowny thing, right?
Right.
And then it's like there's a bunch of really fascinating, interesting, heavy bands that did artful, interesting records at this time, but nobody kind of had the kind of like the golden key to sort of do what they wanted to do until I would say at the end of the band, like 2009 to 2011, which my gut is like that feels kind of like the peak of the metalcore era. And then and then just nothing after that, right? Which I'm not at all qualified to talk about what happened after that. But yeah, no, I feel like that was kind of, those early years were very fascinating, where it's like, we felt like we knew what we wanted to do, but we were experimenting, but we had space to experiment. And then suddenly years later, late 2008, 2009, 2010, when we finally felt like we figured out what we were going to do, it felt like, well, there was this moment where bands were experimenting and we had very kind of diverse bills of bands that were doing interesting stuff. And then late 2008, 2009, 2010, uniform, just here's the scene. Every band sounds like this.
Yep.
Here's what they do. They all have the breakdown. And then that was kind of the moment that we did our thing. And it was like, wait a minute, hold on. Like we were still trying to figure out what we were going to do, but I kind of miss that moment of experimentation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel that the kind of the moment, the potential of what could happen is always so much more exciting than whatever the reality ends up being. And it's not even, even if what you end up doing is fantastic and wonderful, that, you know, people don't just fear the unknown. The unknown's kind of exciting too. Like, ooh,
exactly.
Here's my chance to kind of jump in and show the world what I've got going on. Now I got to figure out what I've got going on.
Yeah, no, exactly. That sort of moment of experimentation is I think exactly right. Yeah.
Well, we're going to circle back to some of that here in a little bit, but I want to go back. The discography discussion in me always likes to start at the first record and
I love it
and move on. I just do that for convenience. It'd be really hard for me to like come up with something like true, like tie it all together like a puzzle, you know? So chronological order works for me really well. So, you know, the first record that I heard was The Everlasting Man, but you actually had a release before that called Hear the End. And I was listening to it at work this morning. And it's funny because the first time I heard that record, I was really, really into The Everlasting Man. So I was like, oh, Hear the End's pretty cool. But, you know how it is. The first record you hear by a band's always the best. Even though that's not technically true. But I guess because they're the most similar musically to each other. Yeah. So, you know, I just want to get a little bit of history on, you know, how the band came to be and, you know, what inspired, you know, really what your spark was to go from a music fan to a music maker.
Totally. Yeah. So we started in high school, as a lot of bands I think do. And it was sort of just three of us, myself, our bass player, Dan, and I'll get into it in a second. Our now deceased best friend, Kyle Cook, who's the other guitar player, who we sort of met at church and this kind of thing. And it's just your typical kind of high school band. You're listening to your favorite bands and you want to kind of like just rip off your favorite bands or whatever.
Of course.
And then I went to college and my friend Kyle called me sort of late in fall semester of my first semester of college. And Kyle had been battling cancer his entire life. In fact, long before I ever met him, and he had a fake leg, which was great. He was actually this is sort of just a weird side note. He had a really experimental surgery where this is a little graphic, I'm sorry, but they cut off his leg above the knee and replaced his knee with his foot joint upside down. So
interesting.
His knee was his foot. And this was at the time. This would have been late 90s, early 2000s, in experimental therapy. I'm sure somebody else knows more about it than I do. But anyway, the point is that it was a thing where it's like you have bone cancer and we have to do something about it. But we have this experimental therapy process where we can do something where you can maybe still have some kind of use of your leg.
Right.
And he could still drum and he could still use it was his right leg, but he could still use his right leg to play drums. Right.
Okay.
And so our earliest demos were Kyle played drums, I played guitar, Dan, who's still in the band, plays bass. Anyway, point being, he called me late my first semester of college and he's like, my cancer's back. It's a terminal diagnosis. I don't know how long I have left. And I just sort of had this moment where it was like, I'm going to drop I shouldn't say in retrospect, but like, it was just like, I'm going to drop out of college. I don't care. I'm going to come home and I'm going to write music with my friend in the last like 6 months that he has left. And so I finished the year barely and then just like moved back home and we wrote half of what was that Hear the End record. And then Kyle died in the summer of the next year. And we had a couple other people that joined the band at that point. And it was a really beautiful time, and I cherish it a lot. A lot of friends in the scene, and everyone knew Kyle, and he sort of really had this sort of like, place in the scene where everybody knew him, he ever knew. And he helped us write those songs. And so the chunk of what became Hear the End was sort of out of the writing sessions of Kyle, sort of at the end of his life. And he could he couldn't sit out of a chair, but he just sort of playing guitar, and so that's the chunk of the record. And there's a song on the record, obviously, about him that we wrote after he passed. But so the point being is that was sort of the foundation of the band. And then after he passed, it was kind of a thing of like, okay, well, I dropped out of college, and the rest of us have sort of been like, let's just focus on this for a year. And now Kyle passed. What do we do? And we were like, well, he would be really pissed off if we were like, all right, that was fun. Let's all not do this anymore. So we were like, all right, let's keep playing music. And then we just started writing more songs, and then, kept playing shows. And at first it was just like the four of us who were in the band at the time. And then we added a couple people, and then we added someone else, and sort of just added on the way. And what became The Everlasting Man, I think, was sort of out of that moment, right? Where it was just sort of like this moment of collective trauma and remembrance. And then kind of a better way of saying it, maybe rather than collective trauma and remembrance, is something like a shared experience of, at the same time, kind of sorrow and remembrance, but also looking forward and trying to do something new. And so when I think about The Everlasting Man, I would say it was exactly that moment of transition, sort of into that moment of let's build something out of this moment of collective pain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of pain on the record. That's for sure. You can just feel it in the tone, but it's not like, I don't know, it's not like a wallowing in your own shit kind of feeling. You know what I mean? It's it's a very positive vibe. And I think I was actually unemployed. So this is weird. I'll get into this with Realis as well. So I was unemployed, whenever I got The Everlasting Man. And, that was actually one of the very first digital purchases I ever made. I bought that and a whole bunch of face down releases, and yours was it was the most different, it was, cause I was depressed, I wasn't I didn't want to listen to For Today or, stuff like that. It was just, that stuff super great and positive and heavy, but I didn't really want to be positive, and so I dug into that. I played a lot of, Borderlands, I believe, on the Xbox 360, just looking for jobs and listening to A Hope for Home. That was the first,
oh man,
yeah, it was sad. But obviously, here we are. But yeah, so it was one of those.
Means a lot, though, man. Thank
yeah,
you.
It definitely, it definitely helped me out, quite a bit. I love the electronics, number one, not to take away from the emotion part of it, but I love the heavy use of electronics. I think the only other record I'd really heard that on was kind of it was a little bit of the first As Cities Burn record had a little bit of that, and then yours had a lot of it. So it was more of what I was into. And but yeah, it's really interesting about that record because, number one, how serious the subject matter is, and I guess one of the questions that I had was, did you guys always start as was your intention to start as a Christian themed band?
Yeah, this is the classic question, right?
I ask everybody the same one. Yeah,
totally. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and actually, side note, I'm actually kind of interested in trying to think this through in sort of an academic sense, and have been wondering about somebody needs to write a book about this scene and what happened. Precisely because of the question that you're asking, is I feel like it would be knowing that a lot of these bands took a similar chart that we did, I would like to really think about that. No, but I guess the question that you asked, the better answer is just that it's not going to be a great answer because it's what everybody says, and it's just that from 2006 to 2009, there was this thing that happened in the music scene in which the Christian music industry had a kind of hegemonic power and a cultural kind of cachet that really determined a lot of what happened, right? And depending on where you were in the country, and we figured it out only when we started touring, that it's like we thought it was sort of powerful in the Pacific Northwest, which we're from, right? Like Tooth and Nail's from Seattle and we're from Portland.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then when we started touring and we got into the deep South, we were like, holy shit, man. Like this whole thing in the South is, and then we found bands that are like, none of us are Christians. None of us give a shit about any of this stuff. But like, if you want to be a band that sells records or does anything, you do this. And that was very weird to, in part, like we all grew up in the evangelical church and we all grew up as Christians. And it was just sort of a thing of like, I would say for us as a Hope for Home, it was like the way we made sense of our feelings at 19, 20 or whatever, feel of like work through this is like the language we had was what we had learned growing up in the religious systems that we had been given and the culture that we had been given, right? And we felt very, at the time, and I'm so proud of it, it's different now, but like at the time I felt very proud of being like, we're not just going to write a Christian record, we're going to write a record filled with doubt and like question a lot of the things we were taught. But even at the time, you brought up As Cities Burn earlier, and it's like that was not necessarily out of the question at the time, right? A lot of great Christian bands sort of had great records that sort of dealt with this kind of question, right? But it really was, once we got on tour and we saw that, like, holy shit, man, like there's a whole thing outside of this, that they're not bands necessarily, not all of them. I mean, they're amazing bands and our friends' bands from the South or whatever, but like there are at the same time a lot of bands who like you have to be a quote unquote Christian band in the scene to like do anything and get on a show, to even get on a show and do it kind of, and that was very new to us. And we, to this day, I still don't quite know how to deal with that. But I mean, what I would say at the time is that we never, at the time, it wasn't necessarily a like, we are a Christian band. It was just sort of a like, here's the language I know to how to grapple with the questions that I'm asking, if that makes sense.
Sure. You were Christians.
We were Christians, and I know
you wrote about it, but you weren't like an evangelical
absolutely
sort of
not.
deal. Yeah.
And I listened to your earlier podcast with Andy from Plea, who's a dear friend. And he talked a lot about this thing that happened, and we saw only once we got signed with Face Down and you went and did shows, that was like, you'd have an altar call. And that's insane to me. And like, maybe it was just that we never got big enough, but like that, we never even got to that point. It was like, to be a Christian band, it was like in between two songs, it would be like, hey everybody, so we just want you to know that here's the thing that we believe, and if you want to come talk to us after the show, come talk to us, kind of a thing, right? And like that was the extent of it. And like, if you're a Christian band, you said that kind of a thing. And we never really even did that at the time. And it's like, you read our lyrics and it was like, okay, we would have like biblical references and biblical metaphors or whatever, but I mean, I don't know. I still struggle with that and think about, where we went with it. But to answer your question, it was never a conscious intention to be like a Christian band that would have an altar call and do this kind of thing. And it was just sort of like, it was the late 2000s, and that's the language that we had to make sense of it. Sure.
No, I get that. And, this is one of those things that I mean, obviously, if you listen to my other interviews, like I must be like laying awake at night thinking about it, because it is a fascinating kind of thing. Number one, the most fascinating thing is how, metalcore and hardcore, especially, it's the weirdest time in music history where suddenly 80% of the bands are Christian, but it's like heavy music, growly music, and all that. It makes no sense.
Right.
But because when I was growing up, I remember getting made fun of for listening to Christian bands, and the bands that I liked wouldn't be able to get on a show because of that. And then so you fast forward, 7 or 8 years, and then all of a sudden now you can't even get on a show if you're not a Christian band. It's a Christian package. It's an all inclusive thing. I mean, I was in a Christian band in 2006, 2007. I know, like it was very much like that. And I think it's just a fascinating question, because I think that Christian music is perceived in such a way. It's essentially perceived incorrectly by most people.
Oh, I like this.
Like it really is, because most people, whenever you say Christian music, are going to immediately think, okay, yeah, number one, altar calls. That's expected. Maybe, they say, if they don't say Jesus enough times, then they're being cryptic, and then they might actually be fake Christians, or they might be,
Yeah.
I mean, ignoring the fact that maybe they're just poetic, or maybe they aren't you, and they don't have the same life experiences as you, and they're total strangers. I think that's the biggest thing, is that a lot of this music that was made by, depressed, hurting kids was being sold as a ministry tool in bookstores.
Exactly. And no, I'm with you. And I was saying earlier that like someone needs to write like an ethnographic kind of anthropological like study of the mid to late 2000s Christian music scene. And one of the things, if I was going to pitch it to a publisher, is I would pitch what you exactly just said, right? Is that, like, on the one hand, you have the militantly evangelical Christian bands that are doing altar calls and doing this kind of thing. But on the other hand, you have all these really interesting bands full of these kids that are like, they grew up in like awful broken homes and like drug addiction and like poverty and shit. And like the music that came out of it maybe was like in lyrics only, couched in kind of like Christian metaphor. But like those records today, for my money, stand up as some of the most interesting art in heavy music of the entire decade, and it's not about like kind of things we feel uncomfortable about, like, what might hold to some evangelical church or something like that. But it's like, no, these were artists who were like really seriously grappling with stuff. And I will, to the end of my days, go to bat for the bands that I grew up on listening to, and being like, there was something that was happening like 2003 to 2010. I don't know. Extend that how you will, but you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but it's weird too, because I tend to focus on the negativity of it maybe a little too much. That's what the people that email me say, is that I focus too much on the negative side of it. But on the other hand, though, there's this weird symbiotic relationship to that negativity, where that scene couldn't have grown and couldn't have blossomed like it had if not for it being sold in bookstores and CDs being passed out at youth group and things like that. So it's like that was the backbone. I mean, sure, some bands broke off into the general market, but we're not all Under Oath. We're not all As I Lay Dying, or all of that. So like it's really strange how that symbiote, like all that negativity, all that judgment and pain, and people being fake and all of that, is still accounts for a large portion of the success of that scene.
100%. Yeah, no, 100%. And with everything that I just said, it was like, I've got like maybe 7 bands I could list on my hand that like I could say count for the first thing I said. And then the second thing I will say, right, is that the rest of it was just utter just shit. Like,
yep.
It just, we got so disillusioned, and we're just like, we don't want anything to do with this. This is just awful. Yeah.
Sure.
But, yeah.
Well, so then what's the pressure then, if we're talking about perception, what's the pressure then in, signing with a label like Face Down? I know it was Strike First at first, which is like, I guess, Little League Face Down,
Right.
Right. And, what is the pressure like in that, you're out on the road, you're seeing this, you're starting to realize that this isn't necessarily exactly what you think it was going to be. But you're also signed to a label where you feel like, you kind of have to be that, because every other band on the label is like super brutal, like tough guy, hardcore, in your face, I'm tougher than you, that sort of stuff. And then here's A Hope for Home over here that's like, oh, hey guys, let's just sit down for a minute and talk about how this makes us feel.
Yeah, no, I love how you put that. Yeah, I mean, it was weird. At the time, it was like, so we released we released a version of the Everlasting Man on our own in I think it was late 2008. And Jason from Facedown, Jason Dunn, the CEO of Facedown, found us on MySpace, which of course at the time was like, that's where you went to be a band, right? And was like, I would love to put out this record on Strike First. And we were like, well, one of my favorite bands at the time was Means. I don't know if you remember the band. They only did like 2 records.
Yeah, I talked to Aaron a lot. Yeah, he's cool.
Great band.
He has a podcast too.
Oh, really? I got to check it out.
Yeah, Growing Up Punk. Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. But we were like, I love that band. And then like, holy shit, Comeback Kid put out their first record on Facedown and all these other bands. And we were like, yeah, man, like this is it. And it was really just a matter of, we were getting attention from someone in the scene and someone who had a track record of something. And we're like, absolutely, we will sign. And not just absolutely, we will sign. Maybe here's a better way of saying it. We got weirdly the perfect storm of the attention from someone who we knew at the time, and even where our influences were going was not necessarily where our aesthetic influences were going, but in in meeting with him over the phone and then in person, we were like, well, aesthetically, we might not fit on this record, but I trust this person more than anyone else in the industry. And I think that's the weird perfect storm of what happened with Facedown. And I would still continue to this day. It's like, I don't regret signing to Facedown at all whatsoever. Not one bit. Musically, it was absolutely the wrong choice. And there's an entirely other trajectory, I think, that A Hope for Home could have taken. And we were doing something at the time, I think, that could have turned into something else. And we possibly could have signed to some other thing at the time. And then you hear the horror stories about, Tony from Victory or, even stuff at Tooth and Nail or this kind of thing. And it's like, we signed this contract with the last honest person in the music industry, who is Jason Dunn from Facedown Records. And then the problem is that his record label just does not fit the kind of music we want to do. So it's this very weird kind of middle point. And like, I don't regret it at all. Jason's a good friend. I will go to bat for that man. And I think anyone who's been on his label would say the same thing. He's as I said, the last honest man in the music industry. But it was really weird at the time. We were very excited. And we released The Everlasting Man, and then we did Realis after that. And he was nothing but supportive. But like, just every day was kind of a slow accumulation of like, oh shit, what we want to do does not fit on a record label that has like Facedown Fest, that is just, more hardcore bands and then a deathcore band and this kind of thing. And like, we don't quite have a way to do it. And then like, even he started to expand a little bit, and the more interesting artsy bands were really, for the most part, kind of worship bands, right? And it's like, well, we're also not we're not a worship band either. We wanted to like tour with bands on like Translation Loss and like Hydra Head and this kind of thing, right? And when you look at the numbers, we could have done it, but it was just like the kiss of death, Facedown, HXC, that kind of thing. And we were like, well, there we are.
Yeah, I mean, and unfortunately you're grouped in, at that point where I think, and that's the interesting thing. Everything you said about Jason is true. I mean, I've interviewed tons of Facedown artists or ex Facedown or in current. Yeah. Nobody's ever said a bad thing about Jason ever.
I love him. He's just yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, because I definitely that was the thing that stood out the most to me when I bought all those Facedown releases, was that your guys' record sounded different. Although it wasn't a deterrent for me. As a matter of fact, it was kind of like, I don't always believe these super hardcore in your face bands, Right. And sometimes that's just more of a feeling than it is anything you can really prove. But so you're out on Facedown. So are you at this point trying to? I mean, are you basically going on tour with these Facedown bands, or were you trying to strike out even as early as Everlasting Man, into getting into kind of a different side of the industry?
We tried. It really wasn't a ton, right? So like the tours we did on Everlasting Man were a bunch of sort of very kind of independent underground kind of tours. We toured with this great band that some guys that are now still lifelong friends. The band was called TIE Fighter. And they turned into the bass player joined this band called Silver Snakes. That's now a great band. We went out with War of Ages for a couple weeks. We went out with Wrench in the Works, and then our dudes in Hands, who became our other. Hands was sort of our fellow, like, oh, we're doing like post-metal weird shit, and like we don't quite fit, so we will just always play shows together, kind of a thing, right?
Sure.
But the Everlasting Man tour cycle was definitely they didn't quite know what to do with us, and we helped find things through the booking agent, who is the drummer for Today at the time, and they'd find things, but they just never quite worked. And to this day, I think the real thing is just like I see a lot of the bands that really picked up, I would say like 2012, 13, 14. And it was just like, we were just literally like 4 years early, you know?
Yeah.
And I wonder sort of kind of what would have happened, but it was at the time, it was just like the only bands in your draw range and your scene and your label range that you can sort of go out with are not bands that quite work with what you're doing. And the connective thread was like CCM, some kind of CCM heavy, right?
Yeah.
And nobody worked quite on that thing, but that was the only through thread in which the way that the booking agency and the record was able to make sense of what we were doing. And in retrospect now, I'm like, well, I know what I would have done different. But at the time it was like, I don't know what else to do, man. It's just metalcore bands. And that's sort of what we did.
So that's why I think maybe why when Realis comes out, it's clearly almost the result of that.
Yeah.
That burnout, that type of like, okay, we really want to do something to set ourselves apart. And I love that record.
Thanks, man.
I really do. And I shouldn't, because so another funny story. So when Realis came out, I was stoked, right? But I didn't listen to it. I had bronchitis for like a whole weekend. And so I think I called into work on a Friday, and then I came back on Monday after having bronchitis for 2 days. So I'd basically missed like 2 days of work. And I come back on Monday and I listened to like the first 2 or 3 songs on Realis on the way to work. Then I kind of get inside. Nobody's making eye contact with me. And I'm like, okay. So then, yeah, they call me into the office. 10 minutes later, I get shit canned. And I'm just like,
oh, no.
Well, I was like, what is it with A Hope for Home and me and unemployment? You know, like I have a hope. I want to keep my home, you know, like it doesn't make sense. So it's funny because I'm just petty enough to where I just like set the CD aside, didn't listen to it for like 6 months, not even out of spite. It was just like, I don't want to listen to a CD that reminds me of getting fired, you know, like that's no fun. So, but that record really like, cause I was like really hardcore into stuff like ISIS and,
Yes.
and yeah. And like, I mean, so whenever I heard that, I was like, okay, so these guys are finally like listening to the good shit, you know, like this is sort of, post metal is probably one of my favorite genres of music. Just because like I like heavy music, but I also like to chill.
Yeah. And do both at the same time. Why can't you do both at the same time?
Right.
You know?
Because I mean, and it's what's interesting about you guys doing it and Hands doing it, other than A Hope for Home, Hands, and maybe Trenches, there was nobody else in that. Yeah, like there was really nobody else in that scene that was doing that I know of. Obviously, there's probably thousands of bands that nobody ever heard that were doing it, but you know, you guys were the only ones that were putting records out in that style. And it's interesting too how Realis has just enough of the Everlasting Man sound on certain songs to where, and this is a question I always wanted to ask, and it's kind of a jerk question, but are some of those songs that sound more like Everlasting Man there just to like maybe hold on to the threads of anybody that was still listening after that? Or was that what you really wanted to write? And I only say that because I've heard In Abstraction.
Yeah. Which we'll get to, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it could just be a transitional thing, but I'm a music critic, so I like asking really annoying questions like that.
The honest answer, and once you asked it, I like immediately my brain was like, oh God, what carried over? Nothing carried over from the Everlasting Man era. So what happened is Face Down 2009. We met with Jason. Side note, we don't have to necessarily get into it, but we also kicked our drummer out of the band at this exact same moment. And it was a very tumultuous time. Cornerstone,
so he got fired too. Okay.
He got fired, yes.
There's a pattern here.
Cornerstone 2009 was the turning point, and we fired our drummer, and then also learned at Cornerstone as we were firing our drummer that we were being bumped up to Face Down to do this record, which is very like, oh shit, what we're gonna do.
Big leagues. Yeah.
And it was a like, okay, you get this much money, which was nothing. But now that we're like trying to do new record, like nobody gets any money anymore. So that's shocking, but that's another story. Anyway, point being, okay, find who you want to do, like who you want to spend like X amount of money with. And it was like, oh, okay, well, we can afford drums at a real studio. And I had just really gotten into this record by this band called Mouth of the Architect.
Okay, yeah.
It's called Quietly. And it's still, to this day, one of my favorite records. It's just this like incredible sounding post-metal record, ambient, weird. But they recorded it at Red Room in Seattle, which is, again, Matt Bayless, who does, he did all the Minus the Bear records, but he did, of course, infamously Isis's Panopticon and a bunch of these like early 2000s Hydra Head heavy records. And I was just like, we are doing anything we can here. But sort of your question being, did anything carry over from the Everlasting Man? Weirdly, like I may have had a riff here or there, but this was the first time, because we had gone from Hear the End and Everlasting Man were like written over the course of like 9 months and slowly written. And Realis was like August 1st, we stopped touring. September 1st, we go in Monday, Wednesday, Friday to the practice space and we write this album. And we just every day we write it. And everything we did sort of just in that moment hash it out collectively. So I really think a big part of it was not just that, we obviously got a new drummer and did this kind of thing, and not just that like we had maybe a riff or two here or there that we could connect, but it was very like intentionally, we're a new band and we are now going to do the stuff that we all have been listening to while playing shows with like punk bands and screamo bands, and like here's the kind of record we want to write now, and who gives a shit who we will possibly tour with. And of course, the downside of this is we're listening to the masters in the studio at the very end of the cycle and listening to it and like, oh wait, shit, we still have to go on tour. Who the hell is going to tour with this record?
Right? Hands.
But yeah, no, exactly. That's it. It's just hands. I would say, I don't think there was necessarily an intentional connection between that and Everlasting Man. It just sort of happened, and we just sort of woke up one day and just decided that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, it's very sparse. I'm not saying that like there's like, I think the record actually flows really well, and has kind of a light dark theme to it, which I like. It starts darker, gets more positive as it goes. And so that's thematically fun because I can listen to, if I'm in a bad mood, I can listen to the first half of the record. And if I'm in a good mood, I'll listen to the second half. But like, I think it's really cool. And I think it was really bold. Cause this is one of those things that like, if we were doing a discography discussion right now on A Hope for Home, my co-host would be like, what happened here? Like where was the, how does this work or whatever? And of course I'm over in my corner being like, no, it's brilliant. It's awesome. It's great. It's all this and they're like, right. But like these guys totally turned their back on their fan base or something like that. But I don't think that like, at least for me, I didn't see it that way because something I think that a lot of bands from that scene maybe didn't grasp is that your audience grows with you.
Mm-hmm.
So while you're taking all these influences, listening to all these Hydra Head bands and stuff, so are your fans. They're getting into it as well. So This is where, if I was writing for Rolling Stone, I'd be like, wow, these guys really matured here. I hate that word. I hate that word so much when music reviewers use it because, oh, this band really matured here. So what you're saying is if you like their old records, you're an immature piece of crap.
Right, exactly.
Like,
like this shit sucks. All the new stuff is mature. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny too because if it's a major publication, if those even exist anymore, it's usually their most like mainstream accessible record ever. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
They matured, and that your grandma likes it now.
Yeah.
Looking at you disturbed. Yeah, but like, no. So that was a really cool record, and then how was that received? On the road,
not great.
Yeah.
I remember one distinct memory I have on this record, and it really was. It's like to this day, and I don't regret anything. But at the time, honestly, it was terrifying. It was because we had all quit our part-time jobs, and we were like, we have this record put out, and we like now have a year and a half sort of like booked that we're going to be a professional band. And then we released this weird, difficult record on this album, and we were fucking terrified. Like, what did we do? Like, and what the thing I remember is I remember driving somewhere in the Midwest. I forget where, but we were going to show. We were on tour. We were on the Face Down Records Young and Reckless tour, and In the Midst of Lions headlined, and then
STL.
Yeah, we played so many Missouri dates on this tour, and then Hands and Us and Onward to Olympus, and our record came out on that tour. And I remember the day our record came out, we were in, I think it was St. Petersburg, Florida. I remember less the name of the venue and more what the venue looked like. And I remember going back into the green room and like on my iPhone, my very new iPhone, because iPhones are brand new at the time, like refreshing iTunes' like album like numbers and being like, oh my God, what's our numbers? It just came out, right?
Yeah.
And we did okay, but it was just very like then the next day we go to another show, and I don't mean this as a dunk on these guys. We toured with these guys, and they're great friends, the Onward to Olympus. And we would always, at this time, anyone who's been in a band at this phase knows exactly what it is when you sort of do, you camp in Walmart. You camp in the Walmart parking lot and sort of in the back of the parking lot, and you do whatever. And, you take a sink shower, and then you go back, and then you open your doors and grab some beers and do whatever and sit in the parking lot and hang out. And the Onward guys asked us to listen to our new record because it just came out. And like, all right, screw it. Yeah, let's play the record. And they were just very like, oh, okay. And the thing I'll never forget, somebody asking was like, did you mean for your guitars to sound like that?
Oh, no.
And we were like, yeah, like we're not like, but then it clicked, right? It's just like, we really like these guys and they're great friends and they're like in a metal band, but it was like, we're not doing that kind of thing. Like we intentionally ran single coil Telecasters through like late 70s Marshalls to have this like feedbacky, clangy kind of sound that we sort of wanted to do it. And it just sort of clicked at this moment that like, oh no, we all just quit our jobs and like tried to sort of do this thing. And like, maybe this wasn't the right place to sort of put this out. Right. But anyway, this sounds very self-defeating, but the same point, like I'm really proud of it and I'm really excited we did it, but it was just sort of a moment of like, I'm really proud that we did this thing and put out this record, on a label that might not have been the right label to sort of put it out. But at the same time, it's like, we didn't risk, maybe the gut, we second guessed it, but we just put it out and we're like, you know what, this is what we have. And this is what we're going to put out, and we're going to do it.
Right.
And
I get it.
And I to this day, like when I think back on that record, it's everything we've ever done as a band. That record is the record I'm the most proud of. And it's if there's one thing that I would say is like the Hope for Home thing, it's that record. And I would still, I'm really excited about it. But it was those like 2 years were very weird. They were very strange years. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't necessarily sound like you second guessed yourself too much, because because if you guys were second guessing yourself, In Abstraction would be called something else and would sound like The Everlasting Man, right? All right. So you stuck to your guns. So I think that makes it more admirable, because even if I was the only guy on earth that would have been pissed off if you'd have gone back to the older sound. But at that point I was kind of scared to listen to your records because I didn't know what kind of life event was going to take place.
You get fired again.
Probably. That's not the last time I've been fired. I'm not very employable. But because I'm very opinionated. So I've actually found a much better medium to get all that out now. So, but I think that In Abstraction is really cool because I feel like, and this is what I was kind of getting at with my question earlier about Realis versus Everlasting Man. I feel like you can the transition isn't as jarring as maybe you think it is, or as much as people would lead you to believe that it is.
I appreciate hearing that. Yeah, thank you.
It is kind of more of a transitional record, it's just more of what you were transitioning to than it was what you were transitioning from. Some bands, every band does it differently, but with In Abstraction, it was kind of like, okay, cool. So now I can listen to A Hope for Home in my Neurosis playlist or in my ISIS playlist or whatever, because it was all about playlists that year. And I really think that this is probably the record In Abstraction is probably the record I listen to the most. I have it on vinyl somewhere behind me. And I'll spin it 2 or 3 times while I'm like cleaning or whatever. The first time I listened to it, I sat down when I got the record. I sat down on my couch behind me and just sat there and, just kind of followed along. Cause I don't know if you've ever done that. It's kind of a dork thing, but you just sit down with the record and you hold it and you look at the artwork and then you flip it over. If there's lyrics included, you read those along with the songs or whatever. That's kind of how I took that record in. And, so, with you sticking to your guns and stuff and saying Face Down is not the right label, were you like convinced? Like, I guess Jason was still just like all about it. Everything you guys did was like the right decision in his mind.
Yeah, and that's why we were so lucky to have someone like Jason, right? Where it was actually, so the story goes, it was our last tour where we basically decided to stop being a touring band. And it was our last tour, and we were on tour with My Epic and So Long Forgotten.
Okay.
And My Epic's drummer at the time. So Long
Forgotten.
Great band from Chicago.
Yeah, no, I saw them in a backyard at my buddy's house. It was an and the show got canceled because the venue like shut down or something. And them and another band called Lori Ann played in my buddy's backyard. That's so funny. I still have the CD too.
Amazing. They're dear friends of ours and an incredible band. Like I cannot recommend their music more. But anyway, it was on that tour, and My Epic's drummer had a health crisis, and so he had to leave the tour, and Jason Dunn actually came and joined the tour and played drums for My Epic on that tour.
That's legit.
And it was an amazing tour. It's still probably to this day my favorite tour we did, but it was sort of halfway through that tour that we were like, I at the time was probably 24, so this would have been like 2010, 2011 maybe. But we just sort of, the older guys in the band were like, I'm just tired of having my mom pay my cell phone bill.
Right.
And also keep in mind, this is in the throes of the Great Recession, right? Like this is like, we are in this phase where it's not good. And so we're like, we can't do this anymore. And so we need to move to a different state. And so what we sort of decided to do was just go home and figure some other stuff out and then record. What we always just wanted to do was write music, right? And like, there's a version of it where it's like, we had great shows and we're just sort of jerking off and doing weird art stuff. And like, I would love to do it, but like shows for the most part were us opening for metalcore bands. And then we show up with our delay pedals and just do weird ambient stuff. And then just everyone looking bored as hell. And it was just like, I would love a show where people are interested in it, but I hate that. And I love messing around in the studio. And so I just want to do that, man. You know, like, anyway, on this tour, we were very sort of like, Jason, look, man, we just want to write music. Like, just like, let's put out a record and like not think about what it would be like to tour on the record. We don't want to think about it needs to have 2 singles or 3 singles on the cycle. Let us write some music and put it out if you feel like it. So that was the sort of the transition to In Abstraction. Is it was we moved home and a couple of us got jobs, went back to school, did this kind of thing. But it was very like every single sound on this record is exactly what we want, and we are not going to think for a minute about like, well, if we play it live, will the dance part be too fast? And I'm not saying we did that on Realis or anything, but like there was certainly an anxiety on the past records about what it would be like. But In Abstraction was the first time it was actually just like, we're not even going to think about any of that. We're just going to write whatever we feel like. And so we wrote a 60-minute record that's like 6 or 7 songs long.
Yeah. I mean, that's par for the course, It's the most honest album title, In Abstraction. I mean, there aren't a lot of records that sound exactly like what their name is.
Oh, I like that.
But it really does. Like it's literally one of the most honest things, whether intentional or not. It's like, yeah, dude. So if you like this, because it's one of those things where it's like somebody's like, oh yeah, I like A Hope for Home. Oh yeah, well, which album do you like? Oh, Everlasting Man. Oh, cool. Yeah, it's a shame that's the last record they put out. You like kind of look around a little bit, and then, but if somebody's like, yeah, Realis, I love that record. It's like, oh, great. Here, check this out. Immediately. And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely awesome. But I guess the question that's kind of beating my brain down here is, if you put that record out, you're not a touring band anymore. So why in the hell has it been 10 years between records? I know I'm saying that as if there's already another record. I know that's probably not really the case, but 10 years, is this just one of those we're all at home and life just keeps happening every time I want to do something?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay.
It was, we did that and we put it out, and I was so proud of it. And I love that record. One of my honestly greatest memories of that record is I recorded my vocal parts for that record the day before I went and I flew to Europe, and I was went to Belgium and France, and I was walking around Paris at like 3 a.m. And Dan, who's our bass player, who's also produces all of our records, sent me, here's the rough mixes for the album. And I just went and walked around the streets of Paris and listened to the rough mixes. And I was just like, this is one of the coolest things we've ever done, ever. And like, I could retire and die happy now. Like just having this. And it was such an amazing experience. But then it was the point where it was like, right, like, a bunch of us went back to school. I finished school a couple of years later. Dan went and got a master's in engineering. People got degrees and did this kind of thing. And it was just, yeah, things got crazy. People started to have kids. And then I finished undergrad 10 years late. And then was like, I don't know what else I want to do with my life. And I applied to grad school and got into a PhD program at Brown and moved across the country. And so really it was like, on the sort of album cycle sort of range, it would have been like 2013, 2014 could have been a good point to do another record. But like, that's exactly when I had moved away from Portland to the East Coast to start grad school here.
Right.
And I've been here ever since. And so we sort of, we of course stayed in contact and did everything, but it was just a very like, In Abstraction kind of led to a hibernation period, I guess.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Because I think in a certain sense too, not having the pressure of being on the road, not having to really meet any expectations, be those external or your own expectations, because you're just like, wow, yeah, I put out this amazing record. What else is there to do? There's that. What was your reaction to the fact that here we are 10 years later, there's still podcasts that want to talk to you. There's still, because one of the things, a very common theme in a lot of these interviews, I love talking to defunct bands. I do, because like statute of limitations are up. You know what I mean? So like whatever there is to say that they couldn't have said then, they can say now. but at least I get the benefit of they've had a few years, so let it kind of like maybe they've gotten over whatever the issue was. But what is it like coming in 10 years later and realizing how many people are still into the band and still care?
Yeah, it was, that's one of, I think, the most exciting things is I remember, and I'm not saying this is what our band is, but there's something like this. And it was when I was in college and high school, I had a subscription to AP magazine. And it was right around the time that Bayside, you remember the band Bayside?
Oh, yeah.
Kind of New Jersey, like not quite post-hardcore, but in that kind of like emo. Anyway. And there were all these articles about Bayside, and what they said is, you've never heard of Bayside, which is crazy, but you've never heard of Bayside. But Bayside is your favorite band's favorite band. And I remember being like, what?
It's a band's band, yeah.
Yeah. But in the years since we've done anything, I'm not saying we're anyone's favorite band's favorite band, but I realized that like the spirit of that comment is exactly, I think, what our band is. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, of course I would trade anything to be like the 2010s turned out differently. And like, I could have had a career out of this and spent, like all this time, like, and gotten like sweet guitars and like made however much money, but like really good friends in up and coming bands that we met on tour who were in young bands at the time. And, bands that are like, by like 2012, 13, 14, that were starting to experiment. They're now doing really interesting things that like we knew when they were like 19-year-old high school kids or whatever, like back in the days. I'm like, no, like maybe we were a little out of time, and like I'm excited to write new music now as we are, but like I'm really pumped that at the time that it felt like this sort of weird moment of just cultural hegemony of breakdowns and just weird music. And we were always so mad about it and felt like there was no one that understood what we were doing. And then like now there's some, not a lot of people, but like some people that are like, no, man, like we listened to you guys like on these records and they meant a lot to us, like Realis and Indistraction specifically, they meant a lot to us. And like, that's so cool. And that's kind of like, at the end of the day, I'm like, that's all I want. If there are like literally 100 total people who listen to Realis and were like, whoa, things can be different. Like that, so I'm done. I did a thing and it was cool. And so that's, I think, one of the things I'm really kind of the most proud about, is thinking about that, and it was hard. I'm not going to lie. It was really hard. And we had gambled our future on it in the moment and learned the hard way that, having good intentions does not lead to paying the bills. But at the same time, then the obverse side of that is also learning that not paying the bills does also not mean that you didn't do something that maybe was useful and interesting to people. And I would not do it any differently at the end of the day. I would take the like random few people who have talked to me and said that Realis meant something to them over we could have had 4 more years to do this. Because let's be honest, even if we did, COVID would have killed us anyway. So
yeah. I mean, they've definitely killed off a lot of the industry.
Yep.
I had to get my Furnace Fest tickets refunded. I mean, come on.
Oh man, I almost flew out for that. I'm not gonna lie. I wanted to see Beloved so bad.
Yeah, I had a hotel booked and everything.
Oh man.
I mean, and I wouldn't have enjoyed it even whenever they reschedule it for next year. I still won't enjoy it because I'll be running around doing interviews and stuff.
Right.
I can't wait till I get to an interview and they'll probably leave it in where I'll be like, can you hold on a second? Yeah, Hope's Fall's playing over there. I gotta go.
I gotta go.
Yeah. But great. Yeah, I hope everybody buys your new record. Have a great night. Yeah, like, I think what's interesting too is like in this modern age, what we're seeing is a lot of bands kind of coming out of the woodwork. Maybe bands that broke up, maybe bands that didn't. But we're seeing a lot of bands realizing that, like, well, if all the fans want is new music, we may be able to facilitate that. I mean, hell, Hum dropped a new record right in the middle of COVID.
Incredible record.
Oh my God. Yeah. My Spotify.
Those last 3 songs on that record are just
Shapeshifter. Okay.
Oof.
because I can't let the record end, so I'll listen to Shapeshifter like 12 times in a row, like just because it's just so good. Well, that song, it's like two songs combined together, like and the second half,
Cloud City and Shape,
yeah, dude, oh my god,
that record is that's my record of the year for sure.
Yeah, same. I mean, and I'm supposed to be like a metal guy, but like it doesn't matter. Like, I'm a much bigger fan of textured, abstract, types of rock and metal, and like that stuff just like puts me in a whole different frame of mind. It actually helps me criticize heavy music better than being just a predominantly heavy music fan. Because I mean, I do. If anybody asks me what's your favorite kind of music, heavy, all day long. But bands like ISIS, bands like Neurosis, and even bands like Hum's pretty far away from metal, even though they're still super heavy. They're still super like intense. But it helps me look at bands, because like there's tons of bands that are great, like scene bands. You mentioned one earlier. I won't mention them again because I don't want anybody to think I'm making fun of them. But like there are some bands that can put out the same record 3 times in a row, but because they're metal and because it's heavy, it's okay. Like you get like a free pass. It's like Slayer syndrome, right? Like Slayer put out the same record how many times? And everybody loved it. But it's easy for me to come on a podcast and just be like, yep, it's all great, check it all out. But in listening to things that are different, and I think that's what I like the most about a record like an Abstraction is your discography really sets up. It's like if you put a double-sided mirror on, like right in the middle between Everlasting Man and Realis, you've got a perfect, like, it's an interesting division. It's weird how like they reflect off of each other and kind of work as two separate entities. Because like you said, it's almost like you get to Realis and it is a different band. Like, sure, I can hear elements of, because at the end of the day, you're still the same dude.
Right.
So like if I'm listening objectively, I can hear that it's you writing, not necessarily that you're trying to like pander to a specific audience. But I guess there was a point in all this somewhere. But it is interesting to see how bands are starting to facilitate new music. And I think, I mean, that's basically where we're at now, right? This is where you're at as far as something is coming.
Yeah. So we've been, the sort of notorious joke is that I have been too much teasing things on our Twitter and Facebook for the past 4 years.
Yes, you have.
But you know what? Like, the other strategy has been surprise album drops, and we are nowhere near popular to drop an album like Beyonce or something. So like maybe an asshole and be like, all right, I'll tease people for 4 years and like release something. No, I mean the realistic thing is I will say for sure we are in the final throes of pre-production for what I think is going to be an EP. But I think what the EP is going to be is we're thinking of doing something like a 2, 3, or 4 EP release, where every 6 or 7 months or so we will release 3 songs. Goal is that the idea of these songs will all build up to be something like the blah-de-blah sessions, or something about like the da-da-da-da years, or something like that.
Okay.
Like while technically we will release each 3 songs on their own independently, the goal is they will all sort of talk to each other and add up to be this big release.
Okay.
And the reason we're going to do it this way, in part especially, is that we all, I'm my PhD this year. Our drummer and his wife just had their second kid. Who knows what the hell is going to happen with the economy and anything like that. But we are very committed to the album form and wanted to release a record. But it was like, if we are like, it's 9 songs or nothing, we felt like we've been trying this for 4 years. It's not going to happen if we do that. So like, we can do 3 songs. We can do 3 songs and an ambient thing. We can do that, and we'll put that out, and then slowly just sort of do that every couple months, and hopefully think about the way in which the form will sort of add up and do something. So the plan right now is, I would say by the end of the year, the great fantastical version is like early fall. We put it out. I think more realistically by the end of the year will be the first EP, and it will be 3.5 songs, and then we'll see what happens after that. But we're basically going to release it on our Bandcamp. It will be purely digital. And we have, I will say, with that said, we have like 7 songs, I would say, demoed out. And for us, the real point is not just releasing everything, but being like, what 4 songs go together? You know, we don't want to just release everything because we're very committed to the album form. It's like we have these like 7 songs, but they're all over the map. And so it's very like, you know, I've been talking with Nathan, who was our other singer. And it's just very like, you know, we've been thinking about what's been happening in Portland with a lot of the, you know, the protests in the streets and the fucking feds like disappearing people and the really scary stuff that's happening, and being like, you know, it's not that we're going to suddenly be an explicitly lyrically political band, but like we have to like, this is what's happening and we have to talk about it and like negotiate it. And so would it really make that much sense right now? We are all I'm not in Portland, but you know, everyone else is in Portland and we're from Portland, and thinking through like, here's a thing that's happening and we would like to think through this. And so we're not going to release maybe the song that's a little more major key and happy, you know, like the first thing we're going to release might be a little bit more kind of like, let's negotiate this and think through it. So anyway, that's the idea, that like they will be 3 to 4 EP releases that will be thematically and emotionally kind of coherent each, and then add up to a full length, something like late 2020 through mid 2022 or something, and then release it. So that's my plan. That's our plan.
That's cool. That's an awesome plan. I like the anticipation too, that there will be between releases. I think that's the most fun thing. And I mean, and there are Hope for Home songs, right? So it's not like we're looking at a 10-minute EP.
No, right. We already have the roadmap for this first EP is already like 30 minutes long, and we're like, okay.
Yeah, there was a time when that was a full length. I mean, shoot.
Right, exactly.
Under Oath's Cries to the Past was like what, 5 songs, and it was 42 minutes or something like that. So I mean, it's I'm not even gonna have that like, oh, but I don't want little short chunks. You know, they're little short chunks for A Hope for Home, I guess is the thing to throw into that. Well, that is super exciting. That's cool. And, you know, I'm sure anybody that wanted to listen to this whole podcast just to hear that, you know, skipped to this part just to hear the news. But no, that's really cool. And it's actually really smart. So I have another podcast called Brutally Speaking. And one of the questions that me and the co-host always ask people is, you know, what do you think going forward is best? Is it better to release music incrementally, like in faster increments, or to drop full albums? And we get a pretty big range of responses. You know, typically the older guys will be like, you know, album all day, every day, you know, whatever. But I feel like a lot of the younger artists are more like, yeah, drop a single, see how it does. Because you can pull so much information out of dropping a smaller sized chunk. I think in the case of a band like A Hope for Home is that you guys kind of do what you guys do. So it's not necessarily the same concept of a new band dropping a single to see how it does, you know? Right. But that is interesting how people have been releasing their music incrementally, but in shorter increments. And I think that the fans really, as a fan myself, like that's exciting. Totally unrelated. Like I bought on my computer, it was like Halo, the Master Chief Collection. And, they only had one game available for me to play when I first bought it. And then 2 months later, I get the first Halo game. And then 2 months later, I get Halo 2 and then 3 and 4. You know, I don't know, but there's something that I just really love about those concepts of you're kind of buying into something, but you're getting more. but it's being doled out in a way to where you actually have time. Because I'll tell you what, I listen to a lot of records. I have to absorb a lot of records really quickly to do the shows that I do. And it is really nice. You can't just drop a record that is super complex and super deep and not expect it to take like 6 to 12 months to like really get it. Like how many records have you listened to where you've been listening to it for over a year and now it sounds like a totally different record than it did the first time you heard it?
Right. Exactly.
So I think that's cool. I guess is.
I mean, one thing I will add to this, and I think you're exactly right. Just very briefly, is to your question of like, what do you do now, right? Because Spotify changed everything, and the algorithm changed everything, and like I am not under any illusion that we haven't. Spotify really came out literally right after we did an abstraction. And so A Hope for Home is kind of like the last band that like was in the CD releasing era. And then like now it's been in the Spotify era. Right. But what I will say as a person who like literally for my profession studies the proliferation of media, is that, distribution channel changes and like the way that media proliferates changes the form of media. Right. And what I'll say about this is like with the album form is like, I, of course, I like the album form and I never want to give up the album form. I want to write an album. But the only reason that the album form exists is because a 12-inch record holds like 25 minutes on each side to add up to about 50 minutes. And just because of the economy of it, bands started to maximize how much music they could put on to release for a certain thing. And then so suddenly there became this form called the full-length album in contradistinction to the EP or the single, right? Suddenly the full-length album was like, oh, a 12-inch record can hold about like 50 minutes of music. Oh, so now the album is 50 minutes long. And that's a form, the album. And it's because there were 12-inch records and they did whatever, right? And so then moving forward to something like streaming digitally, my thought is less like, don't give up the album, which I don't want to. But and then the other one is like, oh, let's just release singles or let's just release one song here and there. It's like, well, okay, if the shape and the size of the 12-inch vinyl record is why the album became to be how long it is, what is the equivalent form for something like a digital streaming artifact, right? Is it just a single, or does the releasing music digitally maybe open up the possibility? Like I don't know. Let's say someone's attention span or some like digital album is something like 3 to 4 or 5 songs and whatever, and then you have a visual component that lends itself to streaming, like that lends itself to streaming in that same way that like the literal size of the vinyl record lended its the album form. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for less like, let's just release singles, and like what artistically can you do with something like streaming and Spotify where you can release something that lends itself to this form in a new art form. Maybe it's not an album. Maybe it's something totally new that nobody's ever heard of. And so I don't know. I'm really excited to check that out. But
that's interesting. Yeah,
that makes sense.
I love the idea of the visual component too. Like, and I think that wherever that innovation ends up inevitably coming from, it'll be in a totally different form than we're expecting, because we're still talking tracks. We're still talking, exactly. Length of it. Like, is it like, if you release an EP digitally, but it's 30 minutes long, is it an EP? Right. Is it, and like you said, what makes it an album? Well, it's the size of the record, obviously, So yeah, that's had not thought about that before. Okay. But now I got something else to think about other than, I wonder why Christian bands died out in the, late 2011s, and none of the bands want to identify as Christian anymore, which
my read is just we all turn 30 and we're like, oh wait.
I hear you. Yeah, it's
which is what happened to us too. So
yeah, I feel you. I went through the same thing on a much smaller scale, but yeah, it's just an interesting thing that we do here. But Matt, I really appreciate you taking the time out and having this chat. This was awesome, and
man, this was a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, anytime.